in 2017. Will the Minister take this opportunity to thank the hard-working poppy sellers up and down the country, including the incredible Gail Wood at the Morley branch in my constituency?
I think we're all incredibly grateful for the many tens of thousands of volunteers up and down the country who give so much of their time for this great cause. And the Royal British Legion have been doing it for generations now, and it will certainly always have our full support in what they do and the impact they have on service personnel and veterans' lives.
And Carden.
Mr. Speaker, to today at the Camel shipyard in Birkenhead, where almost 300 skilled, secure jobs are at risk, despite shipyard winning 2 large MOD contracts worth £619 million. And the GMB and Unite unions fear this is about the casualisation of the workforce. So at this late stage, what action will ministers now take to save these jobs and get workers back to work where they want to be?
Well, obviously it is disappointing to see that there is industrial action, and also we are concerned about job losses. But this, I do have to say that this is why we were pleased to announce that £619 million contract as part of ongoing contracts that we have been giving to UK shipyards around the country.
The Secretary of State will be aware of the case of Gus Hales, who's been on hunger strike outside combat stress in my constituency. What more can the Ministry of Defence do to work with combat stress to get Gus some help, the help he so badly needs?
Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to Gus Hales. I'm very sorry as to what actually happened to him. I've also spoken to Combat Stress. We need to make sure that people like Gus, who have served this country, are looked after. I will make sure that this isn't repeated, and working with Combat Stress to make sure his needs are looked after.
Emma Hardy.
Yes. Defence questions. I spoke about the need for the Brough site, the BAE Brough site, to diversify its manufacturing in order to save jobs. And the Secretary of State told me he had a meeting with BAE. Please could he update me on that meeting and agree to meet with me and workers from Brough BAE site to talk about how they can secure jobs for the future?
Well, my honourable friend, the member for Pudsey, has actually met with workers there. We had a very productive meeting with BAE Systems and also with the Qataris as well in terms of a rollout of the hawk orders for themselves. I will write to the honourable lady separately in order to be able to update her.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that it's 2 years ago this month that the MOD announced plans to close RMB Chivenna. Will he come to the base with me to see for himself why it should remain open?
I know that my honourable friend has been lobbying on behalf of Royal Marine Base Chivenna over the last year. I will meet with my honourable friend to discuss this further, as I know he's been fighting a particularly strong campaign on the matter.
Speaker, the Secretary of State described that he recently visited the Royal Navy's flagship HMS Albion, but why is it in 2009 that the Ministry of Defence defined it as a warship, but in the 2017 National Shipbuilding Strategy it is no longer defined as a warship?
Good question.
Excuse me a moment. I'll try and answer his question.
I must advise the Minister it might not happen again. The Chief Whip is sitting underneath him and looking up at him. Minister.
As I've said before, we have now a national shipbuilding strategy which is ensuring that our shipbuilding industry knows exactly what the MOD will be building over the next 30 years so that they can plan accordingly, but also be competitive on a world market. Surely that's something we should be welcoming.
Finally, the good doctor, Dr. Julian Lewis.
May I give the Minister a second chance to answer the question he couldn't hear earlier about veterans being given the opportunity to revisit the battlefields on which they have fought?
Mr. Speaker, it is important that we give opportunity for those to return to the battlefield. I think the right honourable gentleman was referring to a return to the Falklands, I will endeavour to see what can be done to see if we can use the air bridge to allow veterans to return to that battle place.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the conclusion of our negotiations.
Order. There's Mr. Shannon, sort out your seating arrangements. Well done. And there's a long afternoon lies ahead. Let's have a bit of quiet and respectful order for the Prime Minister.
And with permission, I would like to make a statement on the conclusion of our negotiations to leave the European Union. At yesterday's Special European Council in Brussels, I reached a deal with the leaders of the other 27 EU member states on a withdrawal agreement that will ensure our smooth and orderly departure on the 29th of March next year, and tied to this agreement a political declaration on an ambitious future partnership that is in our national interest. Mr. Speaker, this is the right deal for Britain because it delivers on the democratic decision of the British people. It takes back control of our borders, it ends the free movement of people in full once and for all, allowing the government to introduce a new skills-based immigration system. It takes back control of our laws, it ends the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK, and means instead our laws being made in our parliaments, enforced by our courts. And it takes back control of our money. It ends the vast annual payments we send to Brussels. So instead we can spend taxpayers' money on our own priorities, including the £394 million a week of extra investment into our long-term plan for the National Health Service. By creating a new free trade area with no tariffs, fees, charges, quantitative restrictions or rules of origin checks, this deal protects jobs, including those that rely on integrated supply chains. It protects our security with a close relationship on defence and on tackling crime and terrorism, which will help to keep all our people safe. And it protects the integrity of our United Kingdom, meeting our commitments in Northern Ireland and delivering for the whole UK family, including our overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. Mr. Speaker, on Gibraltar, we have worked constructively with the governments of Spain and Gibraltar, and I want to pay tribute in particular to Gibraltar's Chief Minister, Fabian Picardo, for his statesmanship in these negotiations. We have ensured that Gibraltar is covered by the whole withdrawal agreement and by the implementation period. And for the future partnership, the UK government will be negotiating for the whole UK family, including Gibraltar. As Fabian Picardo said this weekend, and I quote, "Every aspect of the response of the United Kingdom was agreed with the government of Gibraltar. We have worked seamlessly together in this, as we have in all other aspects of this two-year period of negotiation. Most importantly, the legal text of the draft withdrawal agreement has not been changed. That is what the Spanish government repeatedly sought, but they have not achieved that. The United Kingdom has not let us down. Mr. Speaker, our message to the people of Gibraltar is clear. We will always stand by you. We are proud that Gibraltar is British, and our position on sovereignty has not and will not change. Mr. Speaker, the withdrawal agreement will ensure that we leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year in a smooth and orderly way. It protects the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the EU, so they can carry on living their lives as before. It delivers a time-limited implementation period to give business time to prepare for the new arrangements. During the implementation period, trade will continue on current terms, so businesses only have to face one set of changes. It ensures a fair settlement of our financial obligations, less than half of what some originally expected and demanded. And it meets our commitment to ensure there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and also no customs border in the Irish Sea, in the event that the future relationship is not ready by the end of the implementation period. Mr. Speaker, I know some members remain concerned that we could find ourselves stuck in this backstop, so let me address this directly. First, this is an insurance policy that no one wants to use. Both the UK and the EU are fully committed to having our future relationship in place by the 1st of January 2021. And the withdrawal agreement has a legal duty on both sides to use best endeavours to avoid the backstop ever coming into force. If, despite this, the future relationship is not ready by the end of 2020, we would not be forced to use the backstop. We would have a clear choice between the backstop or a short extension to the implementation period. If we did choose the backstop, the legal text is clear that it should be temporary and that the Article 50 legal base cannot provide for a permanent relationship. And there is now more flexibility that it can be superseded either by the future relationship or by alternative arrangements, which include the potential for facilitative arrangements and technologies to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. There is also a termination clause which allows the backstop to be turned off when we have fulfilled our commitments on the Northern Ireland border. And there is a unilateral right to trigger a review through the Joint Committee and the ability to seek independent arbitration if the EU does not use good faith in this process. Furthermore, as a result of the changes we have negotiated, the legal text is now also clear that once the backstop has been superseded, it shall cease to apply. So if a future Parliament decided to then move from an initially deep trade relationship to a looser one, the backstop could not return. Mr. Speaker, I do not pretend that either we or the EU are entirely happy with these arrangements, and that's how it must be. Were either party entirely happy, that party would have no incentive to move on to the future relationship. But there is no alternative deal that honours our commitments to Northern Ireland which does not involve this insurance policy, and the EU would not have agreed any future partnership without it. Put simply, there is no deal that comes without a backstop, and without a backstop there is no deal. Mr. Speaker, the withdrawal agreement is accompanied by a political declaration which sets out the scope and terms of an ambitious future relationship between the UK and the EU. It is a detailed set of instructions to negotiators that will be used to deliver a legal agreement on our future relationship after we have left. The linkage clause between the withdrawal agreement and this declaration requires both sides to use best endeavours to get this legal text agreed and implemented by the end of 2020. And both sides are committed to making preparations for an immediate start to the formal negotiations after our withdrawal. The declaration contains specific detail on our future economic relationship. This includes a new free trade area with no tariffs, fees, quantitative restrictions or rules of origin checks, an unprecedented economic relationship that no other major economy has. It includes liberalisation in trade in services well beyond WTO commitments and building on recent EU free trade agreements. It includes new arrangements for our financial services sector, ensuring market access cannot be withdrawn on a whim and providing stability and certainty for our world-leading industry. And it ensures that we will leave EU programmes that do not work in our interests. So we will be out of the common agricultural policy that has failed our farmers and out of the common fisheries policy that has failed our coastal communities. Instead, as the political declaration sets out, we will be an independent coastal state once again. We will take back full sovereign control over our waters, so we will be able to decide for ourselves who we allow to fish in our waters. The EU have maintained throughout this process that they wanted to link overall access to markets to access to fisheries. They failed in the withdrawal agreement and they failed again in the political declaration. It is no surprise some are already trying to lay down markers again for the future relationship. But they should be getting used to the answer by now. It is not going to happen. Finally, the declaration is clear that whatever is agreed in the future partnership must recognise the development of an independent UK trade policy beyond this economic partnership. So for the first time in 40 years, the UK will be able to strike new trade deals and open up new markets for our goods and services in the fastest growing economies around the world. Mr. Speaker, as I set out for the House last week, the future relationship also includes a comprehensive new security partnership with close reciprocal law enforcement and judicial cooperation to keep all our people safe. At the outset, we were told that being outside of free movement and outside of the Schengen area, we would be treated like any other non-EU state on security. But this deal delivers the broadest security partnership in the EU's history. including arrangements for effective data exchange on passenger name records, DNA, fingerprints and vehicle registration data, as well as extradition arrangements like those in the European arrest warrant. And it opens the way to sharing the types of information included in the ECRIS and SIS2 databases on wanted or missing persons and criminal records. Mr. Speaker, this has been a long and complex negotiation. It has required give and take on both sides, and that is the nature of a negotiation. But this deal honours the result of the referendum, while providing a close economic and security relationship with our nearest neighbours, and in so doing offers a brighter future for the British people outside of the EU. And I can say to the House with absolute certainty that there is not a better deal available. And my fellow leaders were very clear on that themselves yesterday. Our duty as a Parliament over these coming weeks is to examine this deal in detail, to debate it respectfully, to listen to our constituents and decide what is in our national interest. There is a choice which this House will have to make. We can back this deal, deliver on the vote of the referendum, and move on to building a brighter future of opportunity and prosperity for all our people. Or this House can choose to reject this deal and go back to square one. Because no one knows what would happen if this deal doesn't pass. It would open the door to more division and more uncertainty, with all the risks that will entail. Mr. Speaker, I believe our national interest is clear. The British people want us to get on with a deal that honours the referendum and allows us to come together again as a country whichever way we voted. This is that deal, a deal that delivers for the British people, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for the advanced copy of her statement. The Prime Minister may want to try and sell yesterday's summit as a great success, but to borrow a phrase, the reality is nothing has changed. The Prime Minister says if we reject this deal, it will take us back to square one. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, under this government, we've never got beyond square one. The botched deal is a bad deal for this country. And all yesterday did was mark the end of this government's failed and miserable negotiations. There can be no doubt that this deal would leave us with the worst of all worlds. No say over future rules and no certainty for the future. Even the Prime Minister's own cabinet can't bring themselves to sell this deal. The Foreign Secretary said yesterday, and I quote, "This deal mitigates most of the negative impact." That's hardly a glowing endorsement. The silence from much of the rest of the cabinet is telling. They know these negotiations have failed, and they know it will leave Britain worse off. In fact, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research confirmed this today, saying the Prime Minister's deal would mean our economy would be 3.9% smaller than it would otherwise be. This is more than our net contribution to the European Union, which is currently £8.9 billion a year, around £170 million per week. So why is the Prime Minister claiming that extra money to the NHS will be due to the Brexit dividend? Of course, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to the official Treasury forecasts and indeed the legal advice that this House voted to see nearly 2 weeks ago.
Where is it?
The Prime Minister's claim this deal takes back control over our borders, money and laws is frankly a fallacy. The reality is the opposite. The Prime Minister says the political declaration should give us comfort that the Northern Ireland backstop won't be needed. But in June 2020, this country will be faced with a stark choice. We can agree to extend the transition period or accept the backstop. So can the Prime Minister confirm that under her deal, if we are to avoid the backstop, we will have to accept whatever the European Union demands to extend the transition period, leaving a choice of paying more money without a say on the rules or enter a backstop leading to a regulatory border down the Irish Sea? So much for taking back control of our borders, money and laws. Mr. Speaker, it may not end there. The President of France, President Macron, has already made clear what his priorities will be in negotiating Britain a future deal. On Sunday he said, "We will concentrate our efforts in order to obtain access to the British waters before the end of the transition period. And of course, all our fishermen will be protected." Isn't it the case that under the Prime Minister's botched deal, we will have to agree to those demands on access to waters and quota shares if we want to finalise a future trade deal or extend the transition? Breaking every promise the Prime Minister, the Environment Secretary and the Scotland Secretary have made to our fishing industry and our coastal communities. And there was another climb down over Gibraltar at the weekend. Isn't it the case that Spain now has a role over Gibraltar benefiting from any future relationship? That is still to be negotiated, not something the Prime Minister presented to the Commons last week. Mr. Speaker, in 2 weeks' time this House will begin voting on a legally binding withdrawal agreement and the vague wish list contained in the political declaration. The Prime Minister would be negotiating that future agreement from a position of profound weakness, threatened with paying more to extend the transition, with no say over our money, laws or borders, and at risk of the utterly unacceptable backstop, which was only made necessary by her own red lines, most of which have since been abandoned by her. Is it not in the national interest for the Prime Minister to plough on when it's clear this deal does not have the support of either side of this House or the country as a whole? Mr. Speaker, ploughing on is not stoic, it's an act of national self-harm. Instead of threatening this House with a no-deal scenario or a no-Brexit scenario, the Prime Minister now needs to prepare a Plan B, something her predecessors failed to do. There is a sensible deal that could win the support of this House, based on a comprehensive customs union, a strong single market deal that protects rights.
Order. When the Prime Minister was addressing the House, I made it clear that she should be heard, and by and large she was. Those chuntering or yelling from a sedentary position, stop it. It's rude, foolish and doomed to fail. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a sensible deal that could win the support of this House, based on a comprehensive customs union, a strong single market deal that protects rights at work and environmental and consumer safeguards. The Prime Minister may have achieved agreement across 27 heads of state, but she's lost support of the country. Many young people and others see opportunities being taken away from them. Many people who voted Remain voted for an outward-looking and inclusive society, and they fear this deal and they fear the rhetoric of the Prime Minister in promoting this deal. Likewise, many people from areas that voted Leave feel this deal has betrayed the Brexit they voted for. It does not take back control, it will not make them better off, and it will not solve the economic deprivation that affects far too many communities and towns and cities across this country. This deal is not a plan for Britain's future. So, for the good of the nation, the House has very little choice but to reject this deal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to pick up on a number of the points that the right honourable gentleman made, he commented on the Brexit dividend and asked where the Brexit dividend was. We've been very clear that we will be able to use that money that we're not spending to the European Union to spend on our priorities, including the National Health Service. There was a time when the right honourable gentleman himself talked about spending the Brexit dividend on our public services. He talks about the backstop and the implementation period being the alternative. Actually, no, we have written in the possibility of alternative arrangements. The key thing is The key thing is to deliver on our commitment of no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, a commitment which he appeared to dismiss in his response to my statement. We do not dismiss the people of Northern Ireland. We believe it's important to maintain that commitment. He talked about control of borders and said that our deal does not bring control of borders. Well, of course it does, because it brings an end to free movement once and for all. I note that the Labour Party has never been able to actually stand up and say that it wants to bring an end to free movement once and for all, and that's because they're not responding to the real needs and the real concerns of the British people on these issues. The British people want control of our borders, they want an end to free movement. This deal delivers it. He talked about, I was very interested that it now appears to be Labour Party policy to be in both the single market and the customs union. I hear yeses from the front bench. Well, of course, there was also a time when the right honourable gentleman talked about the importance of having an independent trade policy and negotiating our own trade deals. As a full member of the customs union, which he wants, you can't do that. So again, he's gone back on his words in relation to these issues. He talked about the comments that President Macron made in relation to access to waters, and I recognise that this has raised a question among people about the issue in relation to being in the backstop. But for all of those who are concerned, and indeed for all of those who have commented on this, I think it's important to recall that if we were in the backstop, we would be outside the common fisheries policy, and we would be deciding who has access to fish in our waters. He mentioned Gibraltar. I quoted the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who made very clear, as I did, that this government stood by Gibraltar, and we resisted changes to the withdrawal agreement which the Spanish government wished to make. We are clear that Gibraltar's sovereignty will not change. It has not changed, it will not change, and we are proud that Gibraltar is British. He said, I have to say, and finally he talked about dealing with issues of our economy in those parts of the country where we do need to enhance and improve our economy. And I have to say to him, the one thing that is absolutely clear, the one thing that will never deliver for our economy is his policy on borrowing, taxing and spending. It's a balanced approach to the economy that delivers.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I recognise my right honourable friend's genuine endeavours in all these matters and just return her to the point about the backstop? Does she recognise the genuine and real concern held on all sides of the House about what would happen if the UK was to be forced into the backstop? And I listened very carefully to what my right honourable friend said, and she said that the UK doesn't want it, that the EU doesn't want it, and we heard the other day that Ireland said that no matter what any agreement, they would never have any hard border. So it makes you wonder, why is it in the withdrawal agreement at all? But the point I want to make to my honourable friend, and the question really is this: if the government, going down the road toward a negotiation, is heading towards that point when the backstop will become invoked, does that not really generally mean that Mr. Macron is right, that we will come under intolerable pressure to agree almost anything to avoid our entry into what my right honourable friend rightly says is something we never want to be in?
No, can I say to my right honourable friend, I do recognise the depth of concern that there has been and that remains for some members of this House about this issue of the backstop. But I disagree with him about the position that would entail. First of all, because, as I indicated in my statement, and it is largely thanks to my right honourable friend and our right honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, that we are in this position of having within the withdrawal agreement the recognition that there could be alternative arrangements to the backstop or the extension of the implementation period that would deliver for the border of Northern Ireland. But it is right that while I recognise the depth of concern that this is not a situation that the UK wants us to be in, neither is it a situation that the European Union wants us to be in. And the reason is, although strange though it may seem to some members of this House, there are members of the European Union who actively think that the backstop would be a good place for the UK, because of its access to the European Union markets without having financial obligations and without free movement. And so that's why they don't want us to be in the backstop either. Neither of us want to invoke it. The Taoiseach has been clear about that. We want to ensure that the future relationship replaces it and delivers our commitment to the people of Northern Ireland.
Rian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's deal means Scotland is to be taken out of the European Union against our will and out of the single market, a market which is around 8 times the size of the UK. Mr. Speaker, Scotland voted to remain. Our rights must be respected. Living will rip away jobs, hit living standards and end freedom of movement, something that will make it harder for our precious NHS to attract and retain the staff that we need. Migration has been good for Scotland. The Prime Minister talks about queue jumpers from Europe, an outrageous slur against EU citizens that come here. But she blatantly disregards the rights that we will all lose to live and work in Europe. Mr. Speaker, we are not prepared to give up these rights. The Prime Minister's deal carries no majority in this House and has split her own benches. It means a blindfold Brexit is now certain. There is no long-term agreement on our trading relationship with Europe. It is a deal full of ifs and buts. Crucially, here we are again with another sellout to the Scottish fishing industry by a Tory government. Well, we've been here before. We were sold out by Ted Heath and we've been sold out repeatedly by Tory governments. Under this agreement, fishing boats registered in Northern Ireland would continue to gain zero tariff access to the EU and UK markets, but fishing boats registered in Scotland and other parts of the UK would not. We now know that the EU will start negotiations based on existing quota shares. Mr. Speaker, that's not taking back control of our waters. It is the EU exercising an effective veto.
That's right.
Scottish fishing communities have been duped once again by the Conservatives. We on these benches we cannot accept this sellout from the Conservatives. I call upon the Secretary of State for Scotland and the DEFRA Secretary. Search your conscience because your fingerprints are all over this. The agreed declaration states that the transition period after leaving the EU could be extended by 1 or 2 years. Does the Prime Minister accept that that means that the UK would almost certainly be in the CFP with no voting rights for another 1 or 2 years, totally contrary to what the Scottish Secretary has said? The Prime Minister says this deal ends uncertainty. It does not end uncertainty for Scotland's fishing sector or for the future state of the economy, which faces years of turbulence and a bureaucratic tangle. Mr. Speaker, there is talk of a Brexit TV debate. Will the Prime Minister debate with the First Minister of Scotland? Mr. Speaker, the way Scotland's interests have been dismissed by the UK government throughout this process demonstrates the real cost of not being an independent country able to take our own decisions. The day will come, Mr. Speaker, where Scotland will be an independent country. Mr. Speaker, we on these benches will continue to work across parties to put in place a deal that works for Scotland, and we will support another referendum on EU membership.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll address the 2 main points. The Right Honourable Gentleman once again gave most of his comments over to the question of fishing, but he mentioned the question of migration. I think it is important that we deliver on what people voted for at the referendum, and they voted for an end to free movement. And that is because they felt that it was not right that people had a right to come here, were freely able to move here based on the country they came from rather than their contribution to the United Kingdom. We will be able to put in place a skills-based immigration system that is based on people's skills and their contribution to our economy. And then he's devoted the majority of his comments to the whole issue of the common fisheries policy. He talked about a sellout of Scottish fishermen. The real sellout of Scottish fishermen is the SNP's policy to stay in the common fisheries policy. Who is it who has been standing up for Scottish fishermen in this House? Conservative Scottish backbenchers. Never. All the Scottish Nationalist Party want to do, is stay in the common fisheries policy, and that indeed would be a sellout of Scottish fishermen.
Mr. David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the European Union really intends in good faith to rapidly negotiate a future trade agreement, why can we not make the second half of £39 billion payment conditional on delivering it?
As my right honourable friend is aware from the early negotiations that we held on this particular issue, the £39 billion has been determined in relation to our legal obligations. I think it is important that as a country we are a country that stands up to our legal obligations. As my right honourable friend will also know, there is a timetable for these payments spread over a period of time, and of course a key element of this is ensuring that we're able to have that implementation period, which is so important for our businesses, to ensure that they only have to make one set of changes and there's a smooth and orderly withdrawal.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. By refusing to make choices now about our future economic relationship with the European Union, what the Prime Minister has done is to put off the moment when we will have to make those choices to a time when the EU will have much greater leverage over this country.
Exactly.
Because any future trade agreement will require the unanimous approval of every European member state. How can the Prime Minister expect the House to vote to put the country in such a weak position? Is this not the biggest failure of this negotiation?
The right honourable gentleman, I'm sure, is very well aware of the position that the European Union cannot sign a trade agreement with, we are looking for that free trade area, that being at the heart of our economic partnership for the future. The European Union is not able to sign that and to develop the legal text for that until we are a third country, until we have withdrawn from the European Union. But far from not setting out details of our future relationship, the political declaration does just that and makes it very clear that this is the set of, if you like, instructions to the negotiators that the future relationship will put into place what is in the political declaration.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as it currently stands, the majority of honourable and right honourable members in this place will not vote in favour of the Prime Minister's deal, despite her very best efforts. So she needs Plan B. What is the Prime Minister's Plan B? Is it Norway plus the single market, the customs union, which some of us have been arguing for over 2 years?
I'm tempted to say to my right honourable friend that throughout the last 18 months of negotiations, at virtually every stage, people have said to me that it was not going to be possible for me to negotiate a deal with the European Union. No sooner do I negotiate a deal with the European Union than people are saying, well, what's the next thing you're going to do with the European Union? But in all seriousness, I say to my right honourable friend this. We will have a number of days of debate in this chamber prior to the meaningful vote on this deal. I believe it is important that when people look at this deal and come to that vote, they consider the interests of this country, they consider the interests of their constituents, and they consider the importance of delivering on Brexit.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Now that the Prime Minister has decided to launch a public debate on her plans, should she not move beyond her comfort zone of debating with Brexit fellow travellers like the leader of the Labour Party and engage with the much larger cross-party coalition in favour of a people's vote with the option of remaining in the European Union? Will she not debate with the real opposition?
Well, can I say say to the right honourable gentleman, he and his honourable friends have asked me this question about the people's vote, the second referendum, on a number of occasions, and my answer to that has not changed. I believe it is important, having given the choice to the British people as to whether we stay in the European Union, that we now deliver on the choice that the British people made. That is a difference of opinion between myself and him, I recognise that, but actually I think the majority of the British public want us to get on with doing what they asked us to.
Sir William Cash!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister appreciate that the withdrawal agreement is incompatible with the Withdrawal Act of 2018, which expressly repeals the whole of the European Community Act 1972? In this event, we would truly regain our laws. Does the Prime Minister accept that this agreement, being only a treaty, cannot override the statutory provisions of the 2018 Act and is therefore unlawful? Did she seek the legal opinion of the Attorney General on this question in good time before the agreement was signed by her yesterday, as required under the Ministerial Code?
I say to my honourable friend, I make 2 points to my honourable friend. The first is, of course, what the Withdrawal Act does. One of the things the Withdrawal Act does is bring European Union law into UK law, such that there is that smooth and orderly transition when we leave the European Union. And of course, the Withdrawal Agreement will be implemented in our legislation through the Withdrawal Agreement Act.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says in her statement the legal text is now also clear that once the backstop has been superseded, it shall cease to apply. Now, we need accuracy. Actually, in page 309, Article 2 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, it says the backstop can be superseded in whole or in part and shall cease to apply in whole or in part. So we need accuracy here because it's the legal text that matters, and this is what will bind the country. Will the Prime Minister tell us, as the Chancellor has rightly said, that the backstop is bad for the Union, bad for the economy? That's what he has said. Can't you tell us what bits are so bad for the Union?
The parts of the backstop that are bad for the European Union, that they consider... for the United Kingdom. Yes, well, this is what we want to be able to do, is in the future to be able to have our independent trade policy. One of the issues in relation to the backstop is whether or not we would be able to do that. That's one of the issues that we would not want to see within us continuing to be in the backstop for.
Mr. Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend on beginning her campaign to sell this deal to the country with the frank admission just now that it is unsatisfactory. I may say I think that is a bit of an understatement, because it's very hard to see how this deal can provide certainty to business or to anyone else when you have half the cabinet going around reassuring business that the UK is effectively going to remain in the customs union and in the single market, and the Prime Minister herself continuing to say that we are going to take back control of our laws, vary our tariffs, and do, as she said just now, real free trade deals. They can't both be right. Which is it?
Can I, first of all, might point out to my right honourable friend what I said in my statement was that neither we nor the EU were entirely happy with the backstop arrangements that were put in place. That is accurate. I've referenced one reason why we're not happy with it, and I've referenced earlier in answers why the European Union are not happy with it. We will be able to. There is, I know, and there is I recognise a concern that's been expressed about our ability to negotiate free trade deals with other countries on the basis of the arrangement that we're putting in place with the European Union for our future relationship. We will be able to negotiate those free trade deals. But I think every member of this House should be aware that when those trade deals are being considered, there will be issues that this House will want to consider, which will be nothing to do with whether or not we have a particular relationship with the European Union. This House will want to consider animal welfare standards. This House will want to consider environmental standards. These are the issues which members of this House will want to consider when they look at those free trade deals. But it is absolutely clear we will be able to negotiate those free trade deals with the relationship that is being proposed.
Dick Cooper.
Isn't a deal for the future, it's just a stopgap. We still don't know whether this means Chequers or Canada or Norway or an endless backstop or something worse or a massive security downgrade. We have no idea where this is heading, and other countries are already saying that this gives them more leverage.